Good evening. Welcome everyone to the Spring Symposium in Natural Sciences and Human Needs and Global Resources. My name is Jamie Huff, and I serve as Associate Director of the Human Needs and Global Resources program here at Wheaton College. And I'm very glad that you're here with us today. I'd like to start by sharing a prayer that was written by David Nussbaumer. He's a representative of the Mennonite World Conference's Creation Care Task Force. That's a long name. But the prayer, the reason I like it is because it was inspired by St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of Creatures, and also in part by Romans 8:19 through 25. So join me in this prayer. God, creator of heaven and earth, we praise you for the gift of life, for the complexity, beauty, and generosity of this world that sustains our existence and that of all your creatures. At the same time, we recognize the magnitude of what we have done. Climate change, the collapse of biodiversity, pollution, all consequences visited upon every one of your creatures, and for this we repent of injustice, oppression, and destruction. We praise you for the sun, which warms every living thing, and we lament the droughts that endure and worsen. We praise you for the moon, which helps balance the Earth's systems, and we lament the rising sea levels that threaten many populations. We praise you for the wind, which maintains the water cycle vital to your creatures, and we lament the increasingly devastating storms. We praise you for water, without which there would be no life on Earth. And we lament the terrible floods that kill and destroy. We praise you for fire, a purifying force and symbol of your presence for your people, and we lament the ever-increasing fires that devour and suffocate. We praise you for the earth, whose extravagant diversity of fruits nourishes us, and we lament the impoverishment and pollution of the soil. God of oppressed peoples, God of endangered species, you see that we are often both victims and perpetrators. Thank you for your grace that forgives us again and again. Thank you for your promise that evil will not triumph on earth or in our lives. Holy Spirit, you intercede for creation as it groans in the pains of childbirth. You hear our sighs and suffering with and for all your creatures. Fill us with hope tonight for the glorious day when all your children will be revealed and everything on earth and in heaven will be set free. Jesus Christ, you give us the ministry of reconciliation. You show us the way to humility, peace, and self-sacrifice. Teach us to act out of love for our brothers and sisters and for all your creatures. Set us in motion to proclaim your reign of justice, love, and joy. Amen. This year's joint symposium brings together different academic programs and rich traditions of community learning here at Wheaton College. We have some front row seats down here in the splash zone if you want to join us. Under the general theme of scientific practice and prophetic imagination. Let me tell you just a bit about the two programs, the multiple programs that are in fact hosting, and the traditions that I referred to before we get underway. The Human Needs and Global Resources program, if you don't know about it, is an academic certificate program here at Wheaton that integrates multidisciplinary coursework, a 6-month internship, and whole person formation through experiential learning. Since its inception in 1976, way back when I was 3 whole years of age, the program has equipped over 900 students to accompany, learn from, and work alongside organizational leaders in their efforts to pursue lasting and life-giving social, economic, and environmental transformation. We look forward very soon to welcoming our 1,000th intern, most likely in this coming academic year, and to celebrating our 50th anniversary of the program on September 16th and 19th, 2026. You all are invited. Please mark your calendars, September 16th and 19th, 2026. Be here or be square. Didn't really rhyme. In 2005, with the generous support of the John Deere Foundation, the Human Needs and Global Resources program inaugurated its first annual symposium. Each year since then, we've hosted hundreds of guests each fall and spring semester to engage in inspirational, timely, and significant learning with researchers from diverse fields of study, NGO and church leaders, community organizers and activists, artists of all kinds, from all around the world. During my past 11 years participating in symposium events, we welcomed Dr. Emmanuel Katongole, Dr. Melba Magai, Reverend Renee August, Jokabet Solano, Catherine Coleman Flowers, among many others who have inspired us to faithfully accompany communities worldwide toward justice and fullness of life. The Science Symposium is a long-standing annual event that likewise brings together scholars, students, and the public to explore the intersections of science and Christian faith. Each year, the symposium focuses on a specific theme, featuring expert speakers, panel discussions, and performances that delve into contemporary scientific topics and inquiries and their broader social and environmental implications. The Earth and Environmental Science program, with whom we are partnering tonight, and faculty have hosted a number of notable speakers as part of their science symposium over the year, including Yale University geochemist Carl Turakian, Nobel laureate and founding leader of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Sir John Helton, Columbia University marine geochemist Raleigh Roker, and the distinguished atmospheric scientist Catherine Hagel. We are very excited that tonight we have the opportunity to host another distinguished guest, Dr. Christiane Zenner, whose lecture will build on and expand this rich tradition of interdisciplinary learning. Before I invite my colleague, Dr. Andrew Lumen, where are you, Dr. Andrew Lumen? There you are. Who serves as Associate Professor of Geology and Chair of the Earth and Environmental Science program here to introduce Dr. Zenner. I have a few people to thank for making tonight's event happen. First off, I'd like to thank the John Deere Foundation for its ongoing generous support of our annual symposium events. There's lots of people, too, who made this particular event possible. Thanks to Dr. Andrew Lumen and Jeff Yoder of the engineering program for helping conceptualize this symposium and keep the event planning ball rolling all along. Thank you to the Hunger team of Dr. Laura Yoder, Kelly Wilson, Laurel Gorham, and especially Laura Atkinson and Nina Montalava for their logistics, planning, and communication leadership and support. Many thanks also to Fran Tedcom in the Natural Sciences and Associate Dean's Office for her support. Many hands make the work light. Please note that following the lecture tonight, if you didn't know this, we also have a brief time of Q&A with Dr. Zenner. She is really great at answering hard, difficult questions. I just saw that about an hour ago at dinner. So we invite you to stick around and ask her any and all questions that you have. Feel free to write those down as we go. We'll also have some snacks and refreshments to kick off what follows, which is the Hunger Intern Poster Session. You might see some classmates who look unusually fashionable and dressed up this evening. Those would be the Hunger Interns, who at 8:30 p.m. this evening will be sharing a bit about the 18 distinct projects that they carried out as Hunger Interns during their 6-month internship last year in 2024. So they're all dressed up and ready to answer your questions about their work, so please stick around and ask them thought-provoking and challenging questions. I want to now invite Dr. Lumen to come and introduce Dr. Zenner, please.
Dr. Christiane Zenner is Associate Professor of Theology, Science, and Ethics and affiliated faculty in Environmental Studies at Fordham University Lincoln Center in New York City. She works on topics related to theology and science, especially in light of the environmental sciences and fresh water. She is the author of Just Water, Theology, Ethics, and Freshwater Crises. The day I received this book in the mail, I opened it up and didn't put it down until I read to the very end. I was captivated by the ways that Dr. Zenner highlighted various water crises while also asking questions such as, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? To recognize and respond to one's fellow humanity in need. And also stating, but as any ethicist will tell you, inaction is not a neutral position. Inaction is itself always choice. It is a choice not to act. She also beautifully wrote about the woman at the well in her encounter with Jesus in John 4. As a foreign woman who receives a revelation, realizes its significance, and spreads the good news, while also highlighting the daily toil of women water gatherers throughout the world today and all of the burdens that they are forced to bear. Near the end of her book, she wrote, there remains truth in the adage that clean water flows toward power. Freshwater is not merely a matter of hydrology. Hydrosocial cycles are also determinative of social dynamics and questions of justice in access to fresh water. People living in poverty and other forms of structurally embedded vulnerability are most affected by freshwater's absence, especially women and children, as well as groups structurally and historically disenfranchised due to race, class, and legacies of settler colonialism in the United States and abroad. Dr. Zenner, it is such a treat to have you here this evening. Dr. Zenner is also a co-editor of 2 volumes on bioethics, science and society, and sustainability. Her next book, Beyond Laudato Si, is an anti-colonial feminist assessment of Pope Francis's 2015 ecology encyclical in a time of ongoing environmental degradations and social inequalities. Dr. Zenner has also published in venues including the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, as well as the Washington Post, the New Republic, TED-Ed, the New York Times, and appearances on Public Radio International. In 2013, she was named one of Microsoft's heroes in education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christiana Zenner.
Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here. Thank you all for coming out on a Thursday night in what I understand has been a really packed and exciting week. And I hear that Dr. Lubin may have a test scheduled for tomorrow, so thanks to those of you who are in that class. It's good to let your mind rest. You know, you've got to come out and socialize. I also very much want to thank the folks noted previously, Laura, Nina. I'm sorry that I'm referring to everyone by first name, but this is how we've come to get to know one another. And so Jamie, Andrew, our hosts from dinner this evening, that you were at Sharon and Norm, and all the students who came to that event, thank you for the open-hearted conversation, the delicious food, and the fellowship. It really was a very warm welcome, and open-hearted is the word that comes to mind. In the time that I've been invited to give this conversation starter / lecture, I am going to try to do a number of things that honor the joint purposes of the Hunger Symposium as well as the Science Symposium, and hence the jointness of the two. I recognize very much that I am in an esteemed legacy of scholars, teachers, practitioners who have much wisdom to share, so I'm honored to be here, and thank you everyone who has helped make this happen. In addition to those gratitudes of kind hosts, thoughtful students, and all who've made this possible, I also want to acknowledge the many ways that we are placed. And of course, you know where we are in Wheaton and its many legacies in ways far deeper than I do. This is actually, interestingly, my 3rd time in Chicago this month, which is not a normal thing for someone who lives in New York. And I'm really happy to be concluding it here with you all and the type of conversation that we are able to have in this space. Recognizing too that the United States, as a settler colonial nation in its origin, expropriated and expunged Native peoples from very many places that were home to them. And so to the stewards of this place and others in the United States where they are not recognized in the fullness of what might be, I offer thanks and gratitude. So, theology and science. When I'm traveling and have a particularly chatty neighbor on an airplane, sometimes people like to say, so what is it that you do? What are you traveling for? And sometimes I like to pretend that I didn't hear them. Just kidding. Sometimes I vaguely say professor or I work in education, and then sometimes if I'm just really feeling game for it, I'll say, well, I'm a professor of theology, science, and ethics, focusing on fresh water, and a lot of times I get an open-jawed look of like, okay, back to the TV. But other times I get really strong assertions of, oh, well, there must not be much to talk about then, because the assumption is that theology and science are always inherently in conflict. This is an assumption that came, as many of you probably know, from a thesis put forward by 2 scholars who had a bit of a beef with both the Catholic Church and various Protestant denominations in light of Charles Darwin's then relatively nascent theory of evolution. So we're talking late 19th century here. And their thesis was that religion, by which they meant Christian theology specifically, and science, by which they meant evolutionary theory specifically, would always be fundamentally in conflict. This is a very flawed thesis for many reasons, and happy to talk about that in the Q&A or at another time. I teach a class called Human Nature After Darwin, and we talk about all the things. But that's not what this talk is about, except to say that when most people think about theology and science, they assume that it's a conversation of an either-or, and one is right and one is wrong, and people don't know how to have conversations across those domains. As many of you probably know, the reality is actually much more complex. And so today, I am inviting us into, and I hope also modeling, a way of thinking about theology and science that moves us away from that kind of gut instinct of inherent conflict and towards thinking about theology and science in terms of complexity and context. And what do I mean by that? Well, theology, okay, great, what kind? Are we talking about scripture? Are we talking about theological ideas of incarnation? Are we talking about various practices of church communities around the world? Are we talking about ethical commitments? And science, what kind? What type of science? As taught by whom? With what sorts of practices of data gathering? And what sort of scientific consensus? And in what political and economic context that makes those questions particularly interesting or desirable or threatening? And when we get into this terrain of complexity and context, so much is illuminated that is worth exploring. And it doesn't become a question of either or, one side is right and one side is wrong, but it becomes questions of how do we know? And what's at stake? And what should we do? And those are much more generative questions, I find, going forward, than the assumption of conflict. Given the very lovely introduction from Dr. Lumen, thank you. You will certainly have gathered that I work on theology and am very attuned to ecology and environmental science contexts. This is a little bit new in the history of theology and science, because while a range of other topics have been attended to, like is quantum physics compatible with various forms of divine action? Hot question in like the 60s and 70s. And while there have been other questions about, say, genetics and mRNA and a range of responsibilities around those kinds of topics, what has become more evident since the 1960s and beyond is the unfurling of ecological degradation, how that's linked to social degradations and human suffering, and what ecology and environmental science have to reveal about the human situation, as well as how theological ideas and ecological ideas intersect. So that's big, and we're not going to talk about all of it, but I put the ethics in pink over there because I'm trained primarily as an ethicist. And so for me, questions are often, if not always, about, given what we know, what is it that we should do? Or how should we strive to be? And how we know things occurs in so many different registers that can be scientific, social scientific, humanistic, experiential, so many different ways. For me, ethics is fundamentally also about the caliber of our relationships. And those relationships can go in many, many different directions. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Freshwaters, though. That's the topic of this talk, so we will stick to it as best we can, even though water is so slippery that it morphs into everything. And you can't avoid the water metaphor language, so we're not even going to try. We're going to dive in, guys. Okay, fresh water, some facts and all on relatively same page. Universal solvent, a soluble matrix for bodies and ecosystems. There are no bodies, there are no ecosystems generally without fresh water. I mean, except the ones at the bottom of the sea, but we're not going to talk about them today because they're not fresh water. So you can see what I did there. Okay. Fresh water is also regarded as a property, as something that can be parceled up and sold as a commodity. This lends it to its designation as a form of, as something that is amenable to privatization, corporatization, profit, and now speculative finance. Freshwaters are also sites of geopolitical anxieties, scarcity, conflict, wars over water. We'll talk a little bit later about various forms of violences that that can be wrought over waters. Sometimes those are deeply geopolitical in the sense of armed conflict. Sometimes those are conceptual, and sometimes those are the daily toil of water gatherers in ways that shape their bodies and their livelihoods. I will also note in this moment that in the Middle East, and currently, as has been the case for some time, Israel has been using water cutoffs and the bombing of water tanks and whatnot, both settlers in the West Bank and Israel's military apparatus in Gaza as a form of warfare. It is an ancient form of warfare. It is also not at all ethical. Woo! So you can do that. Okay. So the ways that that water can be weaponized are, oh no, oh gosh, are, okay. Anyway, there are multiple ways that water can be weaponized, and while I will be talking about some of the more nuanced and less visible ones, there are also some very, very visible ones in our present day that need attention. Freshwaters have been deemed a human right for all people since 2010. That was confirmed by the UN General Assembly. Several nations abstained from that vote, including the US and Canada. Interestingly, US and Canada share a 4,500-mile border upon which what largest freshwater bodies in the world flow. So, anyway, we're not talking about the Great Lakes, but we are. So the human right for all people, this I'm not going to talk about a ton, but the United States, having not signed on to this, is also not willing to recognize when legal contestations come to courts, say for shutoffs in Detroit, Michigan, or the problems in Flint, because international law on fresh water has no legal standing in the United States. That too is a form of violence. In a theological idiom, fresh water is of course seen as a gift from God. In Catholic circles, and it is understood as a sacrament of baptism, and of course more generally as well, as the water of life. And here I have papal teachings and Christian idioms, because as you probably gathered from my bio, I teach in a theology department at a Jesuit university, which is a Catholic university, and so papal teachings have some sway. Conveniently for someone who talks about freshwater theology and science, it turns out that the Catholic Church, since about the year 2000, has been a really strong advocate for the former point, which is that freshwater is a human right for all people. So one of the ways that the Catholic Church has become more explicitly ecological in its social teaching and advocacy is through the vector of freshwater. And then we also have insights surfacing into public Euro-American consciousness about how freshwaters perhaps ought to be considered relational beings worthy of their own protections and rights. This often comes from indigenous perspectives, and indigenous perspectives are of course plural. Indigenous perspectives should not be extracted for the benefit of monotheistic traditions or scholars like myself who are like, oh yeah, good point, I'm gonna go write a book on that. Because these are ideas that come from community-based, land-based traditions. But the insight is incredibly powerful and resonates very deeply with what I take to be one of the core aspects of ethics which is, what are the caliber of our relations with one another, with the earth that sustains, with fresh waters, with the divine? So, does anyone recognize, not the crops up top, but the, it says it. Okay, 10 points to whoever guesses it. So this is the Lincoln Marsh Natural Area, which, as you know, is right near Wheaton College. I found this out, thank you, Google Maps. But I also found out from colleagues that the Lincoln Marsh Natural Area was voted by the community to be a marsh natural area, which props to marshes and wetlands and all the amazing work that they do. Props to this community for not making it into a housing development, and big props to the community for not making it into the golf course that it was proposed to be. So Wheaton, A+. Okay, what's this up here? Yes, what is water? Okay, well that's water, but that's water. But that is a beautiful little molecule. 104.5 degrees, polar, I think, or is it 103.5? 103?
Right around.
Right, yeah, okay. The PhD is in religious studies. Polar, tetrahedral, all these different chemical excitements going on that make this molecule able to do wonderful kinds of flips and turns and expansions and be the universal solvent that it is. Throw back to chemistry for those of you who are not science majors. Lewis dot structure. Okay. When we look at water relative to land mass, this visualization is from the US Geological Survey in about 2016, I think, and it shows, I don't think there's a pointer here, but there's obviously the globe as a landmass, and then there's the blue circle, which is salt water, and then the smaller tiny little dot that you might not be able to see, which represents the proportion of all fresh water on Earth. In other words, if you look at the proportions, fresh water is a very tiny bit of the overall picture. And the amount of fresh water that is available and regularly flowing through what we came to learn as the hydrological cycle in 4th grade or 6th grade or all the grades, is an even smaller proportion of that. So what we recognize as water in lakes and streams and coming down as rain is a tiny proportion of available fresh water. Most of the fresh water in the world is not surface water. Most of it is locked up in glaciers or ice formations, or it resides and functions in a very slow motion kind of way as groundwater, which is a huge source of water that has fueled the agricultural and manufacturing and indeed economic development of the 20th century, but is actually, in many cases, not a renewable resource. So it's much more like mining when we extract groundwater, and if you're interested in thinking about that in a place proximate to here, you can look at the Ogallala Aquifer in particular. Oh, and we commodify it. We drink it out of single-serving disposable plastic water bottles, which we really shouldn't do. I don't have too many autocratic rules in my classroom, but one of them is no single-serving disposable plastic water bottles. So, you know, everyone gets a pass on the first or second days, but after that, like, it's coming off your participation points, baby. Okay. So waters are all of these things at once, right? None of those things are false. All of those things are true. That's complicated because plurality, multiplicity, can be inherently confusing when we want something to be one way and not another. And how do we think with something that is that slippery? So here are some quotes that I come back to often. The late Ivan Illich, priest and social critic, "I shall refuse to reduce all waters to H2O." I love that, because he's not saying, I refuse to acknowledge that they are H2O, or they're definitely not H2O. He's not denying that. He's just saying, I refuse to reduce them to it. There's always more to be said. That's an important reminder that scientific or technological or economic or even sometimes specific theological claims are not the full story. We need all of these different stories of water to begin to understand its fullness. And then, shut up, ancient philosophy. You never step into the same river twice, for the waters are continually flowing on. Even when water in a river is the river, it's still never exactly the same water. So I did this a little bit with the Lincoln Marsh, but where are we in the greater Chicago area, and particularly, we're southwest of Chicago, right? Okay, cool.
West.
Just west?
Just mostly west. West-ish.
I'm glad to hear that, because the very nice gentleman who drove me from O'Hare here, I said, Wheaton is just west of this part of the city. He's like, oh, no, it's southwest. I was like, okay, you're the expert, whatever. Okay, anyway, so regionally, fresh waters. We've got Lake Michigan, giant, enormous, abundant freshwater entity, hugely potent in so many ways, slightly contested at various times. States like Arizona and Nevada have had their eye on Great Lakes water for a while. Canada, historically, at various periods, has been very nervous that the US is going to get overly thirsty. So there's a lot of geopolitical stuff going on here as well. For example, the Great Lakes Compact between Canada and the US, which was signed in 2008, is a really, really important piece of international agreement and legislation. Definitely look it up if you're interested in it. And actually, when I mentioned I've been in Chicago a couple times this month, which is not normal for me, but it's been really great. One was for the annual climate change conference at Loyola Chicago, the theme of which was fresh waters, and one of the representatives from the Boundary Waters Commission came to speak about the Great Lakes Compact and how important it is, even or especially in this political moment, to stay committed to the hydrological science and to the cross-border community work that has gone on to protect this shared resource. Okay. So the time before that, when I was in Chicago this month, Chicago area, I was in Romeoville at Lewis University. And I was talking to someone who was like, Arizona and Nevada, they can't have our water. It's for people in the Midwest. And I was like, okay, say more. I'm always interested to hear how people are thinking about fresh water and who owns it, because is that a good assumption? Whatever. So he was like, yeah, no, it's for the Midwest. And then I learned that Joliet, which is right next to Romeoville, has a bajillion dollar, I don't know the exact amount, diversion from the Great Lakes to Joliet, but it's technically outside of the watershed. So I was like, hold up. Dude from Romeoville talking about how Arizona can't have the water, but Joliet can have the water, even though it's not supposed to go outside of the watershed. Logic to interrogate here. But what it revealed to me, because we all do this in our different ways, and I've certainly done it in mine, what it reveals is that so many of us have an implicit sense of whose water is where and who deserves it and why. And being able to get at and talk through some of those assumptions is what a lot of freshwater ethics is about. Okay, other regional freshwater stuff as elsewhere. Since Flint, which we'll talk about in a moment, lead in pipes has been a major issue that has come into public awareness. So there's a lead service line replacement program in the city of Wheaton. And one of the reasons I bring this up now is that lead management programs, both in terms of measurement and tracking with the EPA, but also in terms of possible remediation efforts and infrastructure fixes, are among the major rollbacks that have been proposed by this administration. And those have really significant consequences and are deeply problematic. Okay, so that's all very nice in terms of waters, but Dr. Zenner, why are you a professor of theology? It's a good question. One book I really appreciate is written by a now deceased colleague who taught in Seattle. His name is Gary Chamberlain. He wrote a book called Troubled Waters that was published, I think, in 2007 and 2008. It's a little blurry. I was giving birth at that time, so you can only do so much. Here's the quote: "Rarely in analyses and conversations about water are cultural, and in particular religious dimensions brought to light. Yet, for billions of the world's peoples, their fundamental conceptions about the natural world and water are influenced to some degree by religious considerations. How we experience water is a function of place, it's a function of politics, and it's a function of culture and theology and religion." Oh, geez, I keep doing that. Okay. All right, well, yeah, no, okay. So that insight is one of the things that helped to inform the book I wrote, published first in 2014, revised edition in 2018. And the book actually starts with talking about theology and how Catholic theology, but also Christian theology more generally, has come to be more attuned to ecological realities and fresh water in particular. And a conceptual tool that I take from geographers is this idea of hydrosocial cycles. A hydrosocial cycle can be understood by pairing it with, but kind of as a foil to, that idea of the hydrological cycle. Hydrological cycle, waters flow in the various ways. And humans aren't super part of the system, right? It's just like the water and the ocean and the underground and the ice and the lakes and the rain. There aren't generally humans in that schematic. Hydrosocial cycles is a way of helping us to envision, it's systems thinking really, where it puts humans into that equation. So yes, the hydrology, the geology, the climatology, the regionality, all of that is super real and super true. And in addition, there are layers of social action and social rules and social norms that fundamentally also impact how waters flow. So as I would say here, hydrosocial cycles can be understood as how social, political, economic, and cultural factors shape the flows of fresh waters. They are value-laden human decisions. They're not neutral. And because they're not neutral, they're not, self-evident or universal, they're also a really important way of helping us to think with freshwater ethics. Because decisions we make on every level of scale, from the individual to the geopolitical, bear impact for how fresh waters flow and what bodies benefit or bear the burdens. All right, so just summing up points. One, ecosystems, humans, animals, amoebas, all of us are bodies of water, of one sort or another. Fresh waters are universal, but not uniform. That's the plurality point. Like, we all know what it is to experience fresh water. We can all call it H2O, but it's not only that. Universal, but not uniform. Universal, always plural. Sui generis sine qua non. I have to throw that in there to be a real theologian because it's Latin. Sui generis means it's distinctive, it's unique. And in this case, that means it's not replaceable by any other substance. I haven't spent much time talking about that, but it is one of the reasons that fresh water is a hugely important topic for ethical consideration, because literally nothing else can substitute for it in the support of life on the planet or individual bodies. Side note, for those of you studying economics, one of the fundamental assumptions of economics is that some goods are substitutable or substitutes can be found for goods that are scarce. This is not true with regard to water. So what the fork is going on with water economics? Can someone fix that? Thank you. Also, fresh water is a sine qua non, which means a baseline. Without which nothing, literally. You can't do jack without fresh water. So, it is also very deserving of moral consideration. And also, the burdens and benefits, as I mentioned, are unevenly distributed, and thus hydrosocial cycles are a matter for ethics. And that, my friends, is how an accidental theologian comes to write a book on water. Okay. When we talk about hydrosocial cycles, it can be really overwhelming. And I was saying to folks at dinner earlier that I, in a very, very suspect way, I also wrote about this in Just Water, when I was writing my dissertation, had a quote over my desk that I think was meant to be inspiring, but you'll see what I mean. The quote said, "If you want to induce mental meltdown, the statistics of the worsening global freshwater crisis are a surefire winner." Go team! So, a lot of people, including my own, response to the sense of overwhelm and freshwater scarcity and bodily burdens and the scope of the problem is to say, well, how can we fix it? And whose responsibility is it? One of the things that has been a marker of response in US society, in a lot of Western societies, a lot of other societies just general, is the idea that responsibility for fresh water and making sure the water is safe falls to an individual, right? So like the rhetoric of individual freedoms and individualism in the US has some merit. It also goes way awry when we're talking about public goods like fresh water or clean air or whatever. Because guess what? I can't make sure that my water sources are clean, not on my own. It takes all of us. So I also like to draw on this sociologist named Thomas Saz, who in 2008 coined this term, reverse quarantine. The term obviously has a little more punch after the COVID-19 pandemic. But Thomas Saz says, one of the things we're seeing in the United States and elsewhere is the focus on individual households being responsible for what comes through their pipes. So you put in reverse osmosis filters. Yay, big fan. Yes, absolutely. Or you bring in bottled water instead of relying on tap water or well water if you're nervous about those. But the problem here is that it makes us think of water as an individual responsibility and in a kind of property and commodity paradigm where you have to buy the things to make it work, and it's each individual family's responsibility. The problem with this is it's the individualization and the privatization, and it moves the moral attention to individuals or domiciles and away from bigger structural and systemic factors. For example, upstream users like polluting factories or like farms that are putting atrazine in their non-point pollution runoff. So it exonerates upstream users and social, economic, political decisions that have led to pollution and contamination. And that is a problem, because water is not something that stops at the edge of me. Specifically, poorer communities that are often, but not always, racialized, bear the worst burdens almost always, because they generally get screwed in terms of policy decisions. Flint, we'll talk about that. But they also have fewer resources to reverse quarantine or purify themselves. If you have to spend your money making sure that you can meet rent because you're working a minimum wage job in a gig economy and you have to pay out of pocket for your medical care, you sure as heck aren't going to have money for a reverse osmosis filter to put under your sink or in your whole water system. You may not own your house, so you may be renting. And your landlord may be a jerk who doesn't care because they're just getting the money every month. So, Hydrosocial cycles, example 1. Racialized infrastrucures and burdened bodies. These are screenshots from, we are talking about back in the day, 2016. Fire hydrant with lead-contaminated water coming out, lines of people collecting bottled water that was donated. Yes, donating in moments of disaster and sustained need is really important. It is not a long-term solution. Deeper causes need to be addressed. Hydrosocial cycle, example number 2. And this gets back to the, oh, you know what, sorry, I cut myself off here. I forgot to say about the water as a human right. So a number of religious organizations, including some mosques and churches and synagogues in and around Flint, Michigan, came together to advocate for water as a human right during and in the aftermath of that crisis. Many fascinating things happened at that intersection. One is that in February 2017, the Michigan Civil Rights Commission came out with a document that was about the Flint water crisis from a civil rights lens. It's a really good document. It's really worth looking at. It's very educational in many ways. And one of the things they link and they acknowledge is that the history of redlining, segregation, and income opportunities in Flint contributed to a pattern whereby racialized outcomes for lead in the water were very visible, also socioeconomic. But these are not just like, oops, well, we'll fix that, no problem. These are major issues because lead in the water impacts the neurological development of kids and leads to major rashes and other forms of long-term effects in adults as well. So we are talking about impacts that go on for decades, for the lifespan of some of these kids. And the problems are still not fixed. So what do we do about that? Well, the Michigan Civil Rights Commission had a number of things to report. Some of them were very practical. More funding for infrastructure repair, more forms of accountability and community participation in water sourcing. But some of them were almost theological, including they recommended that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission be set up because of the level of violation that had gone on. Come on. Okay, I can use the old-fashioned way. All of my frenetic accidental clicking were out. Okay, thank you. Okay, hydrosocial cycle example number 2. Standing Rock. A lot happened in the 2016-ish era in terms of fresh water coming into public consciousness. And the water protectors' refrain at Standing Rock was, "We are here to protect water because water is life." Minnewachuny in Lakota, water is life. Quick rundown on the Standing Rock water protections and conflict there that emerged is that a pipeline, a fossil fuel pipeline, was going to be built through parts of the Dakotas and had been intended to be routed through other communities, but environmental impact assessments on those majority white communities said, no, this isn't safe. So the reroute happened through historic lands of the Lakota Sioux, including some private property owned by a Lakota Sioux woman. Over time, as the protests against Enbridge, the Canadian company, began to ascend, the protests became very anchored in a number of nonviolent methodologies. So direct action, sitting, protesting, praying, very informed by Lakota spirituality and prayer, and very, very informed by the idea that water is an entity that is deserving of respect, and that in the scheme of relations in the Lakota worldview, it is humans' responsibility to protect the waters from the incursions that busted pipelines and all of these kinds of major projects can hold. So on the one hand, this is important because it shows us an example of cultural and religious constructions of what kind of thing water is. But it's also important because it shows a place where the reigning settler colonial political economic power aspect came into deep conflict with the understanding of water as a relative and something to be protected. So what ends up happening is that despite the water protectors' nonviolent direct actions, the governors of the Dakotas called in policing and private militarized forces to remove aspects of the demonstrations, sometimes remove people, to barricade various roads. And this was done not just in a, let's assemble people to kind of hold the line and oppose one another, but it was also done with really, really high-level military vehicles and equipment. So drones, sonar, a range of other technologies. And I will never forget the day in, it was February 2020. It was an interesting time. But one of my former students, we were in a senior seminar on religion and ecology, and he was presenting on Standing Rock. And he was a veteran. He had been in Army intelligence in the Middle East. And he started researching the militarization of private security forces that were being hired and deployed consonant with the police at Standing Rock. And what he presented to us was examples of how, as an intelligence officer in the Army, who was responsible for helping to deploy certain grades of military trucks and equipment, that it was the exact same ones being deployed against the labeled terrorists and opponents in the Middle East as against the water protectors and residents and citizens of our own nation. All over different understandings of what the land is and who protects it and who can use it and how. There's also, of course, legacies of using water in other conflictual ways. And so when in November of 2016, police deployed water hoses and tear gas against Standing Rock water protectors, they did so on a night when it was freezing cold. And the water from the water guns was ferocious and strong. And not only did it resemble, because the water protectors were unarmed, not only did it resemble the water hoses in the civil rights movement, but it also immediately meant that people on the Dakota Plains would be subject to the risk of hypothermia, frostbite, and a range of other bodily injuries. So, hydrosocial cycles. They are very real, and they are very intersectional. They are not always all terrible, and I apologize for giving you some of the heavy ones. But I do think it's important to note the real intersections among politics, economics, cultural values, and power when it comes to water. So let's come a little closer to home, and let's come to a particular kind of sociality, which is what we might call hydrotheological cycles. I'm very grateful to Dr. Lubin for pointing out that on this very campus is a mosaic that I have not yet seen, but that I am so excited to see. Have you all seen it, I assume? Okay, you can't miss it? Okay. Is it nearby? Is it near Harry? No. Okay. I think that's a tomorrow adventure. But this is an exquisite mosaic from what I can tell from the website. And I loved learning about the story of how it was constructed. It looks fantastic. So, as Dr. Lubin mentioned, in my book, Just Water, the last chapter is about the woman at the well in John 4. And one of the things that I thought I would do as I begin to tie up this many-pronged conversation is walk you a little bit through how I weave the theology and the scripture of the woman at the well with some of what we've been talking about. And then I'll offer a few more concluding remarks. I will read some of this because I did it really well once, so do we need to reinvent it? No. Okay. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Scholars, preachers, artists, catechists have for centuries been entranced by this story and have had a lot to say about it. Centuries ago, Augustine, you've heard of him? Considered this passage to be full of mysteries and pregnant in symbols. Who was this woman, and why did Jesus speak to her? What is the significance of water in the well, and what meanings flow from their exchange? Now, as many of you know, classical biblical analysis has stressed the illicit, transgressive sexual status of the woman at the well. Augustine definitely participated in this. He says, this woman did not then have a husband. Like, bro, how do you know that? Okay. But was living with who knows what illicit partner, an adulterer rather than a husband. Again, were we looking through the marital records? I don't know. But whatever, he's in authority, so okay. The story takes place, after all, at high noon, a hot time of day to gather water, and presumably no self-respecting woman would go to a well at noon to do that. How many of you have heard this interpretation?
Oh my God.
Yeah, right? Okay. So here's another theologian who I don't know how he knows all this stuff, but normally women came to draw water in the morning or evening, the cooler parts of the day. Okay, makes sense. It's strange that she came alone. Both these things suggest the woman felt a sense of shame and was avoiding contact with other women. I mean, maybe, or maybe she worked a night shift. Okay. Sorry, some of these things you might be able to tell are not in the printed version. A third scholar in this interpretive tradition writes, this woman, with her mind on the well, is also focused on a form of flesh, on short-term marriages and affairs with men. She has had a whole slew of them. The situation, therefore, is not promising. Okay. In this manner, generations of readers and listeners from Augustine to the present day have found the unnamed woman sweating through her exile, alone at the well in the middle of the day, confined to the flesh and scorned for it. Her sex confers a type of exile. Plus, to make matters worse, as we all know, Jesus and the Samaritan woman seem to be speaking on different levels entirely. The Samaritan woman seems blatantly not to understand his message. Jesus offers her living water. She asks for a lot of clarifications, perhaps impudently, but at the very least obtusely. Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? For most of their conversation, the traditional interpretation goes, the Samaritan woman seems to miss Jesus' point entirely. But then finally, with some prodding, it begins to dawn on her, living water. Could this be the Messiah? Okay. Then there's a whole tradition, we're fast forwarding a couple centuries and some decades, there's a whole tradition of feminist scholarship that has pointed out, hold up, this woman actually, yeah, it might have taken her a hot sec, but she realized that this was the Messiah, and she runs and she proclaims it. So how about that as a getting it and bearing witness? A little feminism here, please. Nonetheless, this syllogism persists in biblical interpretation of this passage. Jesus is to the Samaritan woman as purity is to adultery, and as spiritual living water is to ordinary well water. You will find this in so many interpretations, and believe me, there are a lot. I've read most of them, and I used to be married to a New Testament scholar, so I know what I'm talking about by osmosis. Okay. More recently, we get the feminist interpretations that say, hey, she actually proclaimed the Messiah. And also, how do we know what we think we know about her in terms of, yes, the text says something, so I'm not trying to discredit that, but also this speculation on her relationship to the flesh is a little above the pale. So now skipping ahead, one of the things that I began to look at is, well, what happens when we look at it through the lens of water? And what happens if we acknowledge that there's this binary going on between living water and material well water? But my question was, how would she actually have encountered and understood water in her day? And I didn't know the answer to that. And one of the things that surprised me is that our esteemed church father Augustine actually has a homily where he talks about this. And what he says is, oh, well, the woman at the well, she was obviously just confused because in everyday language, living water at the time meant water that flows as it is gathered. Water that is not stagnant, water that is not in a pond, water that is not in a cistern. It is water that is coming from a flowing source. And that is then, as now, generally the salubrious, clean water. Because stagnant water carries disease, problems, algae, etc. Flowing water, much more likely to be clean. So Augustine, he who had this negative vision of the woman's sexuality and relationships, also has an explanatory key for why she might have been confused. Because for her, when Jesus said living water, she heard flowing water. So what happens when we think about this story through that lens? What happens when we recognize that the woman at the well may have had more knowledge about the water than interpreters interpreters since 400 and something CE have been giving her credit for? What if she was completely right in saying, what do you mean? And what if that's exactly what Jesus was playing on? Doesn't that change our understanding somewhat? Returning to the scene in John 4, let us presume that at midday, the woman at the well was weary. Desiring rest, desiring shade, she finds herself again at the well, and there, says Augustine, she heaved a great sigh, longing to be done with the need, longing to be done with the toil. Time and again, she was constrained to come to that well, and to carry the load which met her needs, to come back again when what she had drawn was finished. This was her daily toil, because the water assuaged that need, but did not extinguish it. Water was, for the Samaritan woman, what it is for women throughout the world today, which is life-defining work. Not only women, but very often women. It was her daily toil. What is the toil? What are the burdens? Well, there are at least three. One, water is literally heavy and exacting to carry. Human energy is what transports water in much of the world, and that literally burdens bodies, weighs them down. If you've ever tried carrying a couple gallons of water around, you will know what I'm talking about. But since water is bulky and heavy, it also shapes the musculature and the skeletal structure of the women and girls, women and children who must gather it. Plus, it takes a lot of time. So second, freshwater scarcity is a disproportionate burden because it limits economic and educational opportunities for girls and women. There's a ton of social scientific research and evidence that demonstrates that when women and children, especially girls, go to gather water, they are not going to pursue education or other opportunities that lead to flourishing. So many women are deprived of water, of education because of the need to gather water. Furthermore, there is a burden that is related to menstruation, because when there is not sufficient water and sanitation being really tightly woven with fresh water, when there's not sufficient supplies for that, Women who are menstruating often stay home from school out of shame or embarrassment or lack of supplies, and that has a knock-on effect as well. But then, third point, there is another level of burdened bodily vulnerability, and this one due to sexual violence. Worldwide, women do not find themselves at wells midday because they've had 5 husbands, nor do they find themselves pumping bathtubs full of water instead of bottled water instead of lead-contaminated tap water as a result of their sexuality. They find themselves at wells midday or seeking purified water from various dispensers because they have been born female in societies that, in the absence of infrastructure, presume women's water gathering labor. One of the things that tends to happen is that when women go to gather water in parts of the world where infrastructure is insufficient, they are often attacked, sexually, physically, many other ways. And so the tight link between water scarcity and embodied gender violence is very real as well. I'll just add one more sentence from here. Did the woman in John 4 choose to go to the well to gather water? We can only conjecture. A good wager would be yes and no. Yes, she probably chose to go to a certain well at a certain time and not to some other water source at some other time. But it's highly unlikely that she chose, in that sense of ultimate freedom and vocation, to be a water gatherer. It was simply her lot, her daily toil. An unrelenting necessity, born, again, disproportionately by gender. One of the things that I think a reevaluation of John 4 points out is that when we take the lens of water, or when we take a hydrological hermeneutic, and ask what women or minoritized or the communities or vulnerable bodies know about water, we who think we know a lot actually have a lot to learn. Waters are universal, but not uniform. So, what to do about all of this? I've got some thoughts on that I'll end with momentarily, but I just wanted to point out that there's a lot of hydrosociality, theologicality at Wheaton. So I have not asked permission to put these people's names up. Sorry, Dr. Joner and Mark. But a quick glimpse at the website and the folks I've been communicating with indicates that there are many ways that hydrosocial realities flow into work in and beyond Wheaton. So land and forest management deeply interwoven with freshwater. And Laura, we're going to talk tomorrow from 10 to 11, so I can't wait to hear more about your longstanding work and partnerships on that. Water availability and women's health. Dr. Rourke was saying in an email that she has, as a consultant in a prior job iteration, saw and worked with a lot of the data on this, so that the story of the woman at the well and the questions about sexuality and sexual violence are very real for women worldwide, as I mentioned. I also noted the Honduras project, which happens at Wheaton, has some connections. And then Dr. Jeff Yoder in engineering gave me a couple names of folks who have been doing work on water recently. Nora Awad, who graduated in 2023, is co-author on an article about the social construction of tap water mistrust. So for those of you who might be from households where your parents prefer drinking bottled water to tap water, it's an interesting thing to say, well, where does my water come from? And why? And what's the data on it? And how is trust, sometimes mistrust is totally warranted. Like if you've got lead in your pipes, yeah, no, we don't want that. But there's a lot more to the story, and we all can learn about our watersheds. And then at dinner we were talking about Dr. Riley Mulhern, who's about to start teaching at University of Colorado Boulder, who works on well water, lead, and PFAS, as well as quantitative and community engaged methods. So there are lots of ways to think about hydrosociality in terms of your own work. If you're going into law, think about what kind of thing water is. Is it property, commodity, public good? Hint, look at the public good or public trust angle, that's really needed. If you're going into economics, please work on that market failure problem in ecological economics. I have a lot to say there, I'll send you a bunch of articles. Okay. This is some summaries. Wisdom is needed, but it's always dynamic, and it's always interdisciplinary and intersectional. So all of these things matter. I won't belabor the point. Where does this leave you? Well, I'm going to end with a scholar, marine biologist, named Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. Is anyone here familiar with her work? Oh, she's fantastic. Mwah, chef's kiss. She's a marine biologist who's gotten really interested in thinking about climate futures. And her most recent book, after working with a lot of different communities, is called What If We Get It Right? So it's looking at examples of communities and efforts that are working. Now, are they working on some global scale? Well, that's pretty elusive, folks, right? Like, we have to work from where we are, and the scale that each of us can work with is different. But she has, on her website, a fantastic, and she's got a TED Talk on this too, a fantastic model of discernment. She calls it, I think, the climate Venn diagram. I'm sorry that it's a little small, but there's 3 circles. One is what brings you joy. And that's not like what should bring you joy, like what you think your parents want you to do. This is like literally what makes your heart happy and sparks delight. Another circle is what work needs doing. Like any of the things we've been talking about today, but also, things that you see going on. They're like, oh yeah, that needs some help, that needs some effort. And then this question of what are you good at? So that can be what you're studying, hydrogeology, or physics, or economics, or law. But it can also be what you're good at. Like, if you're really good at twiddling your thumbs, I'm gonna have a harder time linking that to making some difference in water. But, I use it as an example, partly because I might be a little tired, and that's a weird thing that came to mind, but also substantially because not everything has to have a degree program associated with it. There are things that you can be good at and that you can love that are seemingly unconnected to what you're studying. But if you're good at them, maybe there's a pathway. Maybe you're a great website designer. Maybe you're a fantastic songwriter. Maybe, who knows? Maybe there's a way for what you're good at to come into this in some way. And especially because you all are in college, what do you want to be good at? Like, you have whole lifetimes to develop skills. And also, you people who are in my age bracket and above, you also have whole lifetimes to develop new skills. Keep learning. This is not like a door shuts when you're 23 kind of thing. So think about what you want to learn and go learn it. All right, so the whole idea is that at the center of that Venn diagram is where your key action resides. Now for her, she says climate because climate's her jam. For me, I say water because, well, it is linked to climate. Like, water's the vector. Water's my vector. Water's my jam. At the nexus of what brings you joy, what work needs doing, and what you're good at, is where you will find some things to do where the energy can be sustained over time. And that matters, because the work is always going to be ongoing. It just depends how you want to go about doing it. I share some further resources. I will share these slides, so anyone who wants them, you don't have to try to, I should have said that at the beginning, sorry. You don't have to try to write this all down. But a book that is explicitly linked to faith and Christian theology is Watershed Discipleship, Re-inhabiting Bioregional Faith and Practice. And that's an edited volume. I have a book coming out next spring that's looking at a range of actions that individuals and communities can take. And then in terms of Christianity, the Ecumenical Water Network is really fantastic worldwide. So again, I'll share all of these. And that's it. Go forth and be fantastic.
We do have time, probably about 13, 14, 15 minutes. I know some of you might have to go out and stand by your posters, but we do have time for questions. So what questions might you have for Dr. Zenner? Any questions? Yes, right here. You can tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm an econ student, so appreciate the shout out there with the substitution effect stuff. Collective action problems. Talk to me about them. You know, we hear all the time that individualization, prioritization are a way to create responsibility to keep things like water cleaner. And if we don't have that, they get polluted. So what's the answer?
Yeah, totally great point. So, I mean, I'm a both and kind of gal. I'm not an either or. So yeah, individual action and responsibility. I think we just had dinner at the Eward's house and they do rainwater collection to the tune of 3,500 gallons in their basement. They can be used throughout the house and washing cars. Public service announcement. Also really lovely Thursday night dinners, but not next week, 2 weeks from now. So I think individual responsibility is good. And obviously, you know, people don't want to be taking in forever chemicals or lead. So being attuned to what's in your local water supply and, you know, what the pipes are coming in, like these are all really good things to be aware of and be on top of. The problem is when that happens in a way that exonerates upstream users and other entities. So a classic example of this is actually with the beverage industry and recycling, as well, and the fossil fuel industry as well, where there's been a lot of emphasis on, oh, well, you need to, you know, recycle your beverage containers or make choices about your fossil fuel footprint. Okay, cool, like happy to. But in the sum of individual actions within systems that offer a limited number of options and are predicated on certain kinds of extractive or polluting incentives is a problem. So how do we move away from that? I don't know, but let's stay in touch about it. Because maybe you'll have some solutions.
What are some practical or like local ways that we can get involved in this conversation?
Totally great question. What are practical or local ways to get involved? Well, one of the folks I didn't put on the slide is actually works, I think, in Wheaton. Laura, I'm looking at you like you would know, but works in, I think, Wheaton public water supply and sanitation. So honestly, having him come talk or, you know, some kind of connection and just like doing educational field trips to like the water purification plants and sanitation systems, like all of that is awesome. The first thing I always say is read up on your watershed and where your water comes from. Because we are, you know, we're earth creatures, very much so, as we're here, and learning about the water that comes to us and how it comes to us, you know, there are a lot of ways to kind of spin it and be cute about it, but it's like, literally, how does the water get here? Totally interesting question that very few of us have thought of. So at Fordham, which is in the middle, my campus is in the middle of New York City, a couple of years before the pandemic, they were doing massive water infrastructure reinvestment and like very old, huge water pipes. But because it's New York City, that is a ton of people. And so they like ripped up the entire Columbus Avenue in front of the school and had these, I mean, just like giant, like height of this room, cylinders that would then go into the earth. And it was just, I had so many conversations with people who were like, the traffic is so bad because these things are out. What is this? What is it gonna end? I'm like, guys, this is your water becoming visible. This is everything that makes your life possible. And they're like, who brought her? But it literally became a series of really fun and interesting conversations. And part of what I have learned in the time of living in New York is that while the history of the New York watershed is problematic because there's all sorts of eminent domain stuff that went on and, you know, some communities and a range of other things, it's also a very extensive gravity-fed system that has a natural gravel and sand filtration. So it doesn't actually right now need additional chemical or mechanical filtration. And so it's a really big water system that doesn't rely on that, which is interesting. So those kinds of, I mean, you'll find out interesting stuff. History of water in the Chicago area, totally fascinating. Yeah. Oh, other things you can do. I mean, people always ask about like the shorter showers and the not flushing of toilets. Oh, yeah, that's getting a lot. Okay. Anyone here grew up in California? Yeah. In the 70s? So, like, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. They gave me a PhD for this, by the way. So that little mantra came about during the droughts of the 60s and 70s in California because, guys, there's fresh water in your toilet, like clean, fresh water. So one of the problems with American infrastructure is that there's clean, fresh water in your toilet. Why isn't there recycled water in our toilets where we don't need drinking level quality water? One approach to conserving water, therefore, is not to flush as often. Okay, I see this as traumatizing people, but work with it, work with it. Individual actions, does taking shorter showers make a difference? Depends where you are. Really depends on your watershed. Not gonna lie. You taking a shorter shower here is not really gonna help someone in Southern California. It's not. What it is going to do is cultivate a habit of mindfulness. And habits of mindfulness, good ones, are virtues. Because virtue, in moral philosophy and theology, is nothing other than a good and virtuous habit. So too with a vice, bad habit. So things that can help attune you to where water shows up in your life, I think are virtuous. Opportunities for mindfulness or thinking about the nuances. And anytime we can pay attention differently, that matters.
Another question? One more?
Can I just say I'm pretty happy that I got, if it's yellow, let it mellow.
Yes.
And the theory of the virtues into the same conversation. I feel like it's maybe one of my finer moments. Thank you.
Well, if that's all, what if we... Dr. Lumen has a question.
Can we get a oh, sorry.
In the striped shirt, did you have one? Yeah.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the Laudato Si and how it informed your work?
Oh yes, thank you for that question. So Laudato Si is this official high-level Catholic document authored, signed by the Pope. It was ghost-written by a committee. I was not on it. But it came out in 2015. And it's the first document in this long tradition of Catholic social teaching to talk about ecology specifically as its focus. Catholic social teaching is the way that the Catholic Church thinks through what it means to love neighbor. Love of God, love of neighbor, deeply woven. So Catholic social teaching is what love of God and neighbor looks like in the world. And there are certain principles, and it's like a whole detailed tradition. So Laudato Si was this document that said, well, we need to think about ecology, and not just ecology in the environmental science sense, though also that, but ecology in like the Greek root sense of oikos, or home, and also dynamic relationships. So relationships between human beings and one another, like the classical stuff of ethics. Relationship between human beings and God, the classical stuff of faith. And then relationships between the earth and human beings. And so part of what Pope Francis was saying was, hey guys, it's time. Like, let's think about this a little more systematically. There's a lot to say about that document, and it's totally worth reading. He also issued a follow-up in 2023 that is way pithier and punchier, and he's like, I think you might not have been listening, world. Once more with feeling, but shorter. So he, in Laudato Si, the first chapter, he addresses it to everyone on the planet. Like, he's not just addressing it to Catholics. But he has a lot where he's talking in Christian language, and especially in chapter 2, where he talks about Genesis and a range of other things. But in that first chapter, he says, look, our common home is falling into disrepair. And here are a number of examples of what I mean. And fresh water, to get to your question, fresh water is one of the examples, that it's increasingly polluted, that it's degraded, that it's impacting the lives of the poor more negatively. He even has a line in there about gender, like that women are disproportionately affected, which, like, for a church that only ordains men is kind of a nice recognition. It's kind of a patriarchal gig. But Laudato Si is really interesting to think with, because he also talks about responsibilities. He calls them lines of approach and action on levels from the individual to the supranational. Like, how do we think planetarily about this stuff? But then in chapter 6, he talks about ecological conversion and what it means to have an ongoing metanoia towards humans and God, and the world is part of that, and creation specifically. So it's an interesting document to read and think with. Each chapter is really different, and that kind of makes it fun as well. Thanks for your question. Andrew?
I was wondering if we could get a brief overview to the book that's coming out, you said 2026.
Oh yeah, okay. So yes. I didn't pay him to say that, guys. Okay, well, no, it's okay. Oh, you know what? The poster reception is in 1 minute. Your computer's notifying me. So, okay, so there's a scholar, a Lutheran scholar named Cynthia Molavita, who wrote a book in 2013 called Resisting Structural Evil. And it talks about love as ecological economic vocation. She's a theologian, she's an ethicist, she's amazing. And she's now, I think, in her 70s, maybe getting on towards 80. And she decided that her next phase was going to be thinking about building a moral economy and what that looks like from a Christian, spirit-filled perspective. She wants it to be interfaith and interreligiously accessible, but her voice is as a Lutheran. So she wrote this big volume that came out in November from Fortress Press. And then there are 6 subsidiary books, one of which is mine, on water. Each of those books follows the same structure, and there are 10 chapters called Fingers on the Hands of Healing. Yeah, just healing, right? Because some are about knowledge, action, thought, follow the money, where to send your finances, all of those kinds of things. And so it's meant to be, there's the main volume that Cynthia wrote, and then there's a climate justice one, water, food, housing, and a couple others. And so each book will be okay, let's look at it from this angle. Here are some examples of things people are doing positively. So kind of in the what if we get it right vein. Here are some things you can think about. Here's a meditation and journaling exercise, and here are some things to try. So that it will be a very practical kind of guide. So yeah, it's fun but a little nerve-wracking because a scholar in me is oh my gosh, there's so much more to say, but it's important. So thank you. Yeah.
Give her a round of applause.
Thank you all.